Today, I would like to talk about some of the most important developments that are taking place in the American labor market and in the U.S. labor market. Over the past 3 decades, there have been very important developments in the labor markets of all Western countries. The labor market that an American worker is facing today, or an Italian worker, or a German worker is facing today, is profoundly different from the labor market that the same worker was facing in 1980. Some of the changes reflect changes in the type of goods and services that we produce in the Western world. But it's not just that what we make has changed, but also how we make it, and especially where we make it. There's a profound reshaping of the economic geography. It's clearest in the U.S., where most of my research is focused on, but I think it's taking shape in Europe as well, including Italy. And I think there are reasons to think that these changes are ongoing and possibly accelerating, and they're going to play a very important role in the coming 3 decades. One important aspect of these changes is that the geography of economic activity is changing. Obviously, we hear a lot about differences across countries. We hear a lot about the fact that Germany is growing fast these days and Italy is lagging behind, or that the U.S. is coming out of the recession in a strong way, or at least it's about to come out in a recession in a strong way, while France is lagging behind. But to me, even more interesting and possibly even more important are the differences within a country. Differences across cities and regions within a country. Not all the cities in Germany are booming. And not all the cities in Italy are lagging behind. Not all the regions in the U.S. are doing great. At the same time, not all the regions in France are struggling. And so what I would like to talk about tonight is some of the changes that are occurring at the regional or city level. And I would like to focus on three questions. First of all, I would like to document the fact that the economic success of cities and regions is increasingly unequal. There's a handful of cities that are attracting very good jobs, high salaries, high productivity, high innovation. And then a lot of other cities and regions that are failing to do so. Now, there's nothing new in the fact that there are rich cities and poor cities. We always had rich cities and poor cities. What's new is the distance between the winner and the losers in this process, and also the fact that they're growing apart at an accelerating rate. Again, this is clearest in the U.S., but I think it's taking shape in more and more clear ways in Europe as well. The second part, I would like to try to explain why we're seeing growing differences, why we're seeing divergence of cities and not convergence, as many economic models would suggest. And the third part, I would like to think about what are the implications for us as societies, meaning the US and Europe and Italy in particular, and also what all these changes mean for economic policy. What should we do about these differences, if anything at all? Now, if you look at the last 70 years, and you try to predict, you try to run statistical models where you try to predict the economic success of cities, what you see is that in the 3 decades after World War II, the best statistical predictor of a city's future economic success was the amount of physical capital and infrastructure that was available in that city. Workers in places like Detroit or Cleveland were among the most productive in the globe because they had access to the best machine and the best transportation infrastructure in the globe. And closer to home, places like Milan, Torino, or Genova also had very highly productive labor that in part because there was this high productivity reflected enormous investment in physical capital. Now, this changes in the 80s. If you look at the period between 1980 to now, the best predictor of the economic success of a city, whether it's job growth or wage growth or productivity growth, is not physical capital anymore, it's human capital. And human capital, the way to think about human capital is education, is human ingenuity, is innovation. The way I measure it in my research is the number of workers with a college degree or more in the workforce in a city. And this variable is enormously is distributed in a very unequal way over space. This shows you the distribution of college degrees across the U.S. now. The dark areas have a high penetration of workers with a college degree or more, and the light areas have much less penetration. The differences are enormous. The places with a lot of college graduates are places like here, San Francisco, or Boston, or Washington, D.C. And we're going to see some of the names in a second. Now, not surprisingly, these areas are the ones that are most responsible for creating output in the U.S. This shows you economic output per square kilometer in the United States. And you see, again, remarkable peaks. New York, Boston, and D.C., Chicago, surrounded by some shrinking peaks here, Seattle, San Francisco, and L.A., surrounded by an ocean of almost nothing. There are two features that I find particularly striking about this. The first one is that it's the amount of blue that you see. It's almost, one way to describe this map is that if you were to drop 70% of the land mass in the U.S. GDP wouldn't change all that much. And the second feature is that these peaks are highly correlated with the dark areas in the previous map. Not only they're highly correlated with the dark areas in the previous map, meaning the areas that have a lot of college graduates, but also these are also the areas that create the most innovation. One way in which I measure innovation is to measure the number of patents per worker in a metro area, in a metropolitan area. And again, you see this ocean of white, meaning very, very few, very little innovative activity going on, with some dark areas that represent the areas where a lot of innovation is being produced. Okay. So essentially, what the picture that emerges, at least for the U.S., is that one of a handful of cities with a highly skilled labor force, which is highly productive, highly innovative, and makes most of the GDP in the U.S., surrounded by an ocean very, very little output produced. The way I describe it in the book, I talk about the three Americas. On one end, you have these cities, the brain hubs, the cities that where the concentration of college graduates in the labor force is above 40%, where patenting is very, very active, and where productivity is extremely high. These are the Bostons, the San Franciscos, the Austins, and Raleigh, the Seattles, San Diegos. At the other extreme, you have cities with a very unskilled labor force, where the concentration of college graduates is low. It's less than it's around 1 in 10. These cities the industry mix is traditional. It's heavily concentrated on traditional manufacturing. Productivity is low, wages are low, and population often is shrinking. The extreme example is Detroit, but it's not the only city. Cleveland or Flint or Buffalo. To some extent, Philadelphia are going that way. And in the middle, there is the rest of America, which could go either way and seems undecided on which direction to take. Now, what's striking is that these three Americas are growing apart, and are growing apart, I think, in an accelerating rate. Now, let me give you a sense of how big these differences are. Here, I ranked all the U.S. cities based on the share of college graduates in the labor force. And I'm showing you an example of the cities that are in the top 15 group. Okay? The cities At the top, you see Washington, D.C., where essentially 1 in 2 workers has a college degree or more. Boston, 47%, San Francisco, 47%, Raleigh, 44%, Seattle, 42%, Austin, 41%. Okay. By the way, when I talk about a city, I really mean the metropolitan area, which means not just the administrative boundaries of the city, but includes the entire labor market, the entire region. The census defines it as a place where 90% of people both live and work. So for San Francisco, it's not just the city of San Francisco, but it's an entire Bay Area, including Oakland and the North Bay and part of the South Bay. Now, in these cities, labor is extremely productive, and therefore wages are very high. The salaries the average salary for a college graduate in Boston or San Francisco is in the order of $75,000 or $77,000 per year. But high school graduates are also very well compensated, presumably because they're also productive there. For example, the average high school graduate in these two cities makes more than $60,000 per year. Now let's look at the cities at the other end of the ranking. These were some of the top cities. Let's look at the cities with very few college graduates. At the very bottom, you have a city called Merced, California. This is a place that is about not even 2 hours drive from San Francisco. In this place, 11% of the workers have a college degree. Okay. Yuma, 11%. Visalia, also 2 or 3 hours drive from the Bay Area. Flint, Michigan, 12%. Now, surprisingly, wages are extremely low here. The wage for a college graduate in a place like Flint is $43,000 per year. The wage for an high school graduate is $28,000. So there are a couple of features that I find striking about this. The first one is how large the differences in human capital are. I mean, the difference between Boston, San Francisco, and Merced and Visalia is stunning. It's 4-to-1. Okay? Almost 5-to-1. Just to put this in perspective, this is much larger than the difference that you see between the U.S. as a whole and poor developing economies like Peru or Bolivia. So it's almost as if within 300 miles, you have some of the most advanced economies in the world with some of the most productive and innovative labor in the world, some of the best paid labor in the world. And then 200 miles away, you have economies that are worse than developing economies, at least in terms of human capital and productivity. The difference is so large that a high school graduate in a place like Seattle makes more than a college graduate in a place like Flint or Visalia. So geography matters, in some cases even more than your own CV. Obviously, more educated workers make more than the less educated workers in every city, but more educated workers in this type of cities make less than less educated workers in the first group, in the first America. Now, what's striking is not just that there are huge differences, but these differences are growing. This shows you the gains, the change in earnings for college graduates since 1980 for the top 10 cities and the bottom 10 cities. Okay? And as the graph points out, there's no convergence. If anything, there's divergence. In the book, I call the great divergence, this trend. So the cities that were strong to begin with are getting stronger over time. And the cities that were weak to begin with are getting relatively weaker over time. This is true for earnings. It's also true for share of college graduates. So these are the top 10 cities in terms of college share, the bottom 10 cities in terms of college share. And again, you see that the places at the top in the first America are growing pretty fast. Over the past 30 years, they added 15 percentage points in terms of college graduates. The bottom 10 cities, the Flints, the Visalia, have added less than 5%. In fact, Flint hasn't added any college graduate relative to its population in 30 years. You see this great divergence along a number of dimensions, whether you look at economic factors, but also social factors. In the book, I have a chapter on health. You see divergence in health and marital status. You see divergence in divorce rates. You see divergence in politics, both in what people vote for and how much they vote. Now, the question that I want to ask now is, what explains this growing apart? We live in at least the U.S. is an economy where the winners are getting stronger over time and the losers are getting weaker over time. What explains this? Well, part of the explanation goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. What's changing is what we make and how we make in Western economies. And in particular, if you look at what the U.S. workers are making, it's clear that the U.S. labor force has shifted from a labor force that was centered around manufacturing to a labor force that is more and more centered on making innovation and new knowledge. This doesn't mean that we're not making physical things anymore in the U.S. In fact, the value of output of manufacturing companies in the U.S. has doubled in this period. But they're using fewer and fewer workers. In fact, the number of blue-collar workers in the U.S. has plummeted. And this shows you blue-collar positions in manufacturing since 1985. It's a pretty flat trend. I mean, I look at a lot of trends in my work, and I rarely see for this long period of time, trends that are this flat. This is not just a recession thing. The U.S. manufacturing was shedding jobs even in the second half of the 90s. It's the dot-com boom, or the Clinton booms, depending on your political inclination. Some people call it the Clinton boom or the dot-com boom. But this is a period where the U.S. economy is adding jobs pretty much in any sector. But U.S. manufacturing is shedding jobs. And it's been shedding jobs at the rate of 380,000 per year for the past 30 years. Now, and what I find striking is that this is not just a U.S. phenomenon. These are data this is the manufacturing share for Italy in blue, Germany in red, France in green, and Japan in yellow, orange. And what's remarkable is that they're all declining pretty much at the same pace. Even Germany, which everybody thinks it's a paradise for blue-collar workers. Well, in Germany, the manufacturing share in 1970 was 40%, and it's about half of it now. You see exactly the same decline in many other countries. Whether you look at the UK or Korea or Sweden, you see the same trends. The intercept differs, so the starting point differs. So the only reason why there is more blue-collar position today in Germany than say in Italy is because they started higher. But the decline is exactly the same. These are like parallel trends. And I didn't want to clutter the figures with 10 other countries, but believe me when I tell you that you can do the same for most Western society, and you see the same trend. So clearly, there's a decline in manufacturing. There are obviously two fundamental reasons for that. One is the automation, and one is globalization. If you've ever been in a factory, especially in the U.S., that's the first thing that you notice, that it's all machines. There's no more workers. There's a couple of guys in a corner typing on computers, but there's no more people physically making things. And of course, globalization, that there are cheaper places to make a lot of the physical stuff that we consume. The reason why I talk about the reason is that there's a lot of talk these days, there's a lot of front-page articles in the U.S. about the so-called renaissance of U.S. manufacturing. And there's a lot of stories about factories that are being brought back from Mexico to the U.S. or from China to the U.S. And those makes great media stories. But when you look at the data, there's no systematic evidence that suggests that this is slowing down in any way. And in fact, these stories are mostly exception, not the norm. So I think that it's unlikely that these trends will slow down. Now, what's particularly striking is that even when you look at high-tech or what we think about as high-tech sectors, and when we look at production jobs in those sectors, you see the same type of decline. This is the employment in the US in computer manufacturing. Employment in the US in computer manufacturing peaked in 1987. This is the year where Commodore 64 was launched. Has been shrinking ever since. Same thing for semiconductor manufacturing. Again, I want to stress that these are production jobs, blue-collar position. Okay? Position in semiconductor has been declining for a decade. And there's one big exception to this decline, and it's position of highly educated workers. So, for example, the number of engineers employed in manufacturing in this period has doubled. At the same time, where the number of blue-collar positions was shrinking. And this reflects, I call it in the book the Apple supply chain, but it really applies to pretty much any part of manufacturing, whether it's textile or cars or chemicals. What's the Apple supply chain? Well, the Apple supply chain is the fact that Apple, that makes one of the most successful global products in the world today, the iPhone and the iPad, the only thing that is made in the US is the design part, is the invention, is the innovation part. All the parts, including the sophisticated electronic components, are all made in Far East Asia, in Singapore and Taiwan. And then they're assembled by hand in a place called Shenzhen, China, where labor is very cheap. And this model is the same. If you look at your clothes, and if they're made in most cases, they're going to be designed in a European country or in the US. They're marketed there, but are physically made in Bangladesh and Vietnam. This is exactly the same supply chain. Earlier today, we were talking with Andrea about the Nuovo Pignone. He was telling me that Nuovo Pignone in Florence has embraced exactly the same model, whereby they used to make physical things outside Florence, and now the only thing that is left there is the design. Now, I actually take an optimistic view of these trends, in the sense that the good jobs, the one with a lot of human capital and a lot of value added, are remaining in places like Cupertino, in the case of Apple, or Florence, in the case of Nuovo Pignone. Now, these are trends that are reshaping the labor markets of all Western economies. But the Western economies are differing profoundly on what's coming in the place of manufacturing. Okay? In the case of the US, it's increasingly innovation. And what I mean for innovation is a very broad definition of innovation that includes, of course, IT, high technology and software and internet, but also life sciences, clean tech, new materials. Part of entertainment, especially digital entertainment. Part of finance. Finance is as an industry is the fourth largest industry in terms of patents that are filed. There's a lot of innovation that is going on in New York. Part of marketing. And what all these industries have in common is two things. One is they make intensive use of human capital. And two, they make a product that is unique. It cannot be easily outsourced to a place like Shenzhen. At least not in the short run. This is just to give you a sense of the growth. This is employment in the US in the internet sector, software, scientific R&D, which is a good proxy for biotech, and traditional pharmaceutical. What you see are growth rates that are explosive. The growth rate in the internet jobs is exploding, even through the recession. Software, people complain all the time about Bangalore and all the outsourcing to Bangalore. Still, jobs in software, in the US software industry, have been growing at the rate that is 15 times faster than the rest of the labor market. Biotech is also promising and keeps growing. Pharmaceutical is more traditional and more established, and therefore grows at a slower rate, but also it's more predictable.